Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next installment of the Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm your host, Ron Kursop, and tonight we'll be answering your questions about budget and finance. I feel like if you've been here for each session so far, we're old friends by now. You know Ron, you know Jerry, you know Rebecca. I'll go through the whole spiel anyway, but I'm really happy that everybody's here tonight. So welcome, and I hope that we have a great evening. If you're new to the group, the purpose of the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club is to provide explanations and insights for the more than 6,000 library trustees in New York State. Each book club session takes a deeper dive into one chapter of the trustee handbook and answers real-life questions received from the field that arise in the area of governance work for library boards. So the first thing I'd like to point out to you, and it looks like there's already a handful of people doing it, you'll notice the chat box that's down there. If you take a moment, you'll see the Q&A and chat box. We'll get back to the Q&A feature in a moment, but for right now, if you have a moment, go ahead and say hi in the chat box. Where are you from? How long have you been a trustee? Your library, and just to say hi and to see who else is on the call. Unfortunately, I won't be able to say hi to each of you individually, but it'll be great to see who's here. And if you see a familiar name come across the chat box, be sure to wave excitedly. I would like to take a moment to thank our promotional sponsors for tonight before we get too far into the program. If we could acknowledge the New York State Library, the Public Library System Director Organization, and the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. Without these groups, we wouldn't have such a great turnout this evening, so thank you so much for our promotional sponsors. Tonight, we'll be discussing budget and finance, the sections in the trustee handbook that goes over these areas. And over the next 90 minutes, we'll receive an overview of the topic from the authors of the trustee handbook. They'll also provide answers to frequently asked questions sent in advance by our viewers, as well as some submitted questions by you tonight. And in order to submit questions tonight, which has been really successful in the past, and I know that people love to get their question answered, you'll see the Q&A button next to the chat area. In order to ask a question, if you could please put it in the Q&A, I'll be monitoring that closely and taking questions from there. So if you could put them in there, that would be great. If last month was any indication of the volume of questions, we won't get to them all tonight. However, we have in the past recorded the Trustee Book Club after party, and we're hoping to do that again in the future. If you visit the Mid-Hudson Library website where it talks about the Trustee Handbook Book Club, you'll be able to see that recording as well as the rest. I would like to say thank you to Casey Conlin and Brian Hildreth for participating in this group as well and helping with facilitating. And I'd also like to introduce our speakers for tonight, Rebecca and Jerry. Rebecca Smith-Aldrich is the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System, and along with co-authoring the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, she also authored the Companion Handbook for New Library Directors of New York State and the Municipal Ballot How-To Guide, as well as 2 books for ALA editions. Jerry Nichols has distinguished himself as a leader in the public library services as library director, library system director, and library educator. He's also considered one of the New York State's most authoritative experts in library management, finance, law, and construction. I've personally learned a lot from these two, and I'm really happy they're here again tonight. So at this time, I'd like to hand it off to Rebecca and Jerry. Go ahead, you two.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to 2022 edition of the Trustee Handbook Book Club. It's my pleasure to start us out and just to want to give you a brief introduction. This topic of budgets and finance is extremely broad. It's incredibly critical, and we urge you, if you have not already, to read and reread our chapter in that Trustee Handbook, and to take a look at the resources that we have there, some of which are from the library community, but many of which are from our state controller. I think they'll really give you background that you may need in order to be intelligent when it comes to dealing with your library's finances. Now, our theme tonight is very simple. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit the Board of Regents. Your job as trustees is to secure sufficient resources and then ensure that they're being used efficiently and effectively toward meeting your institution's goals. And we hope you know your institution's goals. but that's your job, folks. Rebecca?
So interesting fact here, some people might not realize this, but over 93% of library revenues come from public dollars. So a public source, either voter approved funding from your taxes or an appropriation from your municipality, depending on your type of library and your situation. And we point this out to you because it's so critical to understand that not just public libraries, but association libraries as well are receiving the bulk of their funding from public sources. So a lot of times when you're reading the trustee handbook, we're very careful to make the distinction of which laws public libraries fall under, which laws association libraries fall under. And in the areas of budget and finance, we're going to blur those lines. Because association libraries, you should hold yourself to a very high standard given the amount of public dollars that you're receiving. So while I'm sure questions about fundraising are going to come up tonight, I want us to keep this number in mind, that the bulk of our money coming in for essential library services are coming from public dollars. And that is one of the messages here tonight, that we want you to take a hard look at your budget and make sure that your revenues that are coming from those secure and stable tax sources are covering your mission critical items. Library services are too essential to leave to chance. And by that, I mean fundraising. So that's something to think about as you do financial planning for the library for both this year and the years coming, that you've got that secure and hopefully voter appropriated money that's coming into your library, covering all the core things that make you a solid library. And then identifying some of those things that might be, okay if they didn't happen this year, that you can cover with donations from your friends groups or fundraising.
So from the very beginning, both in the trustee handbook and in our handbook discussions, we have discussed your primary job. And that first one, as articulated by the Board of Regents, is the duty of care. And at the heart of duty of care is your fiduciary responsibility toward the library, but not just to the library, to the community who has entrusted you with this wonderful institution. So in order to meet those fiduciary responsibilities, you need to be aware of certain issues and approaches to management. And number one is you need to understand what your financial controls are. Do you have internal financial controls? If you don't know what that term means, it's time for you to go do some homework, work with your director and your business manager or your account clerk and understand what checks and balances you have. You need to have a very well-worn board approval process for expenditures. Rebecca will get to that in a minute when we talk about state audits, but the claims audit process is something that's critical. You need to approve every bill. Financial reports, if you don't understand your financial reports, make your financial people or your director or whatever explain them to you, or simplify them to the point where you understand where your money is going and where it comes from in the first place. Audits, we recommend strongly that you get an annual audit. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Reserve funds, we hope you have reserve funds. And if you do, I hope you're investing them intelligently. We have some guidance for that in the handbook, but it's something that you need to be aware of. And ultimately, then you need policies and procedures, which we will give you links to during this workshop and of course in our trustee handbook, that give you sample policies and procedures for you to follow.
So when Jerry mentioned internal financial controls and making sure we do our homework, it was many years into my service here at Mid-Hudson until I realized many boards didn't even have a fighting chance. They didn't understand what internal financial controls they were supposed to have. And shortly after that, about 10 years into me working here at Mid-Hudson, the Office of the State Comptroller started publishing local government management guides, which you have links to in the handbook, and I think they're going to be popped in the chat box for you tonight as well. But this is where you find the kind of operating manual to the finances of the library. And I'm saying this to all libraries here. This goes to my little message at the top of the hour about association libraries holding yourself to a high standard. These guidelines are extremely helpful to understand accounting practices, oversight practices, the claims audit process. But for the purposes of this slide, what we're talking about are the comptroller's audits of libraries. The Office of State Comptroller is authorized to audit any public library in New York State. And in fact, they've promised to do so. So if you haven't yet had an audit by the Office of the State Comptroller, you can expect to if you're a trustee of a public library. It doesn't necessarily mean you did something wrong. It just might mean it's your turn on the list. And for a public library, they can come in and audit you on any of these a dozen categories that you see here. They'll do a preliminary sweep to see what looks suspicious, and then they take a deeper dive on the stuff that they want to understand better how the board is operating. I think it's really important to do your best to follow their recommendations before they ever show up at your front door, but to also understand that when they do show up, their job is to help the public feel confident that their funds are being used wisely by you, the board, that's been entrusted with those funds. So in the words of my former finance manager here, when we were getting audited by OSC, she said, "Oh, goody," which I know might not be a common response to getting audited, but it's a chance to find out if you're doing it right or not, which is great at the end of the day for the purposes of your role as the governing body of the organization. Now, I will say for association libraries, the Office of the State Comptroller does have the right to audit you on one category, which is your compliance with the property tax cap law. So that is a reason why they could come in and audit an association library as well. So please do keep that in mind. But as you see, this is a very broad topic of things that they may come in and ask you about or look for. So, having you could sometimes have your outside auditor, your CPA, do a process audit for you to see if you're doing well in this area or not. But I will say the local government management guides on the Office of the State Comptroller's website are very user-friendly. Even if you're not a finance person, which many trustees claim they're not, they're easily accessible, they're very well laid out, and really can help you just polish the procedures and policies that you have at your library to feel more confident that you've got a really strong oversight procedure in place.
Rebecca, couldn't say it better, but I have one little brag to do though. In the last couple of years, the audits of the state controller have mentioned that library trustee handbook is a good guideline that libraries should be following over and over again. Those folks that don't do best practices and get caught by the controller, we're quoted in there. So my compliments to you.
I have to remember, Jerry, it was probably one of the better days of my career to have my own work cited back to me by the Office of the State Comptroller. That was pretty cool.
There you go. You deserve it.
So in the trustee handbook, you see there's a big checklist of policies and procedures that your library should have. And we've curated just those related to finance and budget here this evening on this slide. And of course, you'll get a copy of this slide after the presentation this evening. But again, this is an area where I'm happy to quibble with you about where this law came from that requires you to have X, Y, and Z. But I again encourage all library types, public and association, to have everything on this list, even if a law would allow you not to. Let's just think about one or two of these on this list. Whistleblower policy to help protect people in your organization that want to help you as the board understand something you might not be able to see on an everyday basis is actually looking pretty shady and needs to have a closer look at it. You would want to encourage staff to do that kind of thing, regardless of if you're an association or public library. So for those of you that like to argue with me, if you're an association library or a small library about do you really need all of these, my answer is always yes, you do. The minute you accept other people's money to run the library, you have to hold yourself to a very high standard in the oversight of those funds, both public and private funds. So I think what you see here, and I don't think we're going to take the time to go through every single one of these here this evening, but I think you want to see that you're setting the tone, right at the top of that list, your code of ethics, your conflict of interest, disclosure form that you should be filling out every year. And I'm just going to stop and put an asterisk next to that. If you haven't filled out your conflict of interest disclosure form this year, it might be a good sign that your current conflict of interest policy is out of date. It was actually updated in 2014. So you don't want to check the date at the bottom of your conflict of interest policy and make sure it's compliant with current law. But each of these that you can see here, they're going to answer a lot of the questions we know you have here for us tonight, which may mean that you don't have your budget process written down, or you don't have a clause in your financial policies that makes it clear how to amend your budget. So a lot of the questions that come up should be answered through having a full complement of these essential policies and procedures.
So in our trustee handbook, we're very clear that the budget has to be a flexible document, but it also is basically a planning exercise based on your long-range plan. Now, many of you are just now finally getting around to complying with minimum standards that were passed when we did our 2018 handbook that requires you to have a long-range plan. And that means that when you do a budget, it's not just for this year. It means you need to plan ahead and look where you're going. The second point we make about is ensuring stable funding for your mission critical operations. This goes back to what Rebecca was saying. Your money comes from taxes. Is that a secure source? And we both know, because Rebecca and I spend a lot of time on this, many of you are not secure in your funding. You may get municipal funding, for example, being an association library, even a municipal library, but you don't know what you're going to get year from year. Your job is to worry about that. Your job is to plan for the future. Your job is to make sure you have stable funding for your library. And there are resources for that are available on the state library website. And lastly, when we're talking about planning, long-range planning, you have to invest in your library. And in your library is your staff, your building and infrastructure, and what needs the community might have, not just today, but for tomorrow. Are you putting money? Do you have sufficient stable funding for programs that are going to help your community 10 years from now, not just today? And are you planning for the needs of your building over the next 10 or 15 years? I'm not talking about expansion. We're talking about a new HVAC system, solar panels, things of that nature. So that's your job. You have to plan for the future. Delegate responsibility for today to your director and assume responsibility for tomorrow.
So as Jerry said, in delegating responsibility, sometimes it's hard to understand who does what and some of the processes that we talk about here in the Trustee Handbook Book Club. So I did you a solid and I did an excerpt from the Director Handbook, which lays out who takes the lead in which areas of the work. In this slide, we're talking about the roles when developing the budget. And we get this question quite a bit, particularly in smaller libraries where sometimes the lines are way blurrier than in other larger libraries that have staff capacity to do everything under the sun the board would wish they could. So just a little reminder that you are ultimately responsible for securing adequate funding for the library. Your director is your technical advisor. So they're going to be the ones that are best situated to draft your budget. You also have responsibility in the budget drafting process to respond to what the director presents to you, to question things, to make sure some of the items that Jerry mentioned on the last slide, where you're thinking long-term about investing in staff, taking care of the building, being a good steward of the building, investing in the services that are evolving quickly. I think most of us recognize at this point that programming and digital collections are some of the highest growth areas in library services today. Are you adequately investing in them, or are you still investing in the stuff that you wish people liked, but they don't necessarily use very much? So sometimes it's making tough choices about the resources you already have, so you feel really confident when you go out to the public or to your funding authority to justify why you need more than you're currently getting, that you feel very secure in the knowledge that you understand how the money is being spent and why there might not be enough to keep up with being a good steward of the facility, or investing in staff education in a way that will meet community needs, or investing in different format types that are, really driving the bus these days of how people access information, entertainment, and literature. So all of these things come together in a way during your budget planning process, and everyone has a role to play. And it's one of the best examples of why boards are collective wisdom, because each of you are bringing a different perspective about services, about the future, about how funds are spent. So there is a role for everyone to play in the budget planning process, but get off to a strong start by having your director draft the budget to begin with. And then you can see, once you've got the budget approved, it acts like a policy. You've authorized expenditures in the areas that you've approved in the budget, and the director is authorized to spend money up to those levels that you've agreed upon, unless you have policies that say otherwise. So for example, having a procurement policy that indicates at what level multiple quotes must be received for something before a decision can be made, or when conditions change in the course of the year, at what point, when the director needs to spend money differently than it was originally approved, do they have to come back to the board to ask for a budget amendment? Those are questions answered in policy that help things go smoothly and don't slow down decision-making that sometimes needs to be made with, I think, alacrity, right? You've got to keep moving, got to keep getting things done. So those policies help you do that work. So Jerry and I know we have not answered all of your questions on this topic with our quick overview, but we know we've already received a bunch of questions, and we know you're going to give us even more questions today. So we're going to invite Ron to come back on the screen and help moderate the questions we've received and those that are coming in through the software here this evening.
Thanks, Rebecca. Just a couple points. First of all, I was going through the chat. There's a lot of new library people here, a lot of trustees that haven't been on the board that long, a lot of newer directors, some old faces too, but I'm really happy that there's so many new people coming on and learning so much about budget and finance. So this is great. We have received a bunch of really on-point questions in the Q&A section. Remember, if you do have a question, drop it in there and we'll hopefully get to it tonight. But while people are doing that, Jerry and Rebecca, I wanted to throw at you a couple questions that were submitted before the program tonight and see if we can take those first. The first one that we have up, for a municipal library, can the library board ask that library funds that are not spent at the end of the fiscal year be placed in a reserve or capital fund to be used later? Must the unspent funds be part of the fund balance that can be spent by the municipality for non-library expenses?
I'll take this one to start at least. The state controller has been very clear since actually the 1940s that municipalities must keep a separate library fund. And if you look at the state controller's guidebook for managing the municipal funds, they dictate that there must be a library fund. That said, they also say that any unspent funds in the library fund must stay in the library fund. They cannot be transferred to pay for other municipal expenses. It's we have at least 3 controllers' opinions that we can find to that extent, but there's a big but here, folks. Yes, you can have a fund balance and you can dream about that all you want, but that municipality still has the right next year to just cut your budget and make you use that fund balance, which is why some of us have troubles with municipal libraries. But yes, you have the municipality must keep a separate fund, and you have the right to have a fund balance in it. And if you have a good relationship with your municipality, they're going to let that fund grow, and hopefully you're going to tell them why you need this money to plan for roof repair or something of that nature. So yes, by law, they have to have that separate.
Great, thanks, Jerry. The next pre-submitted question that we have, what interest accruing / investment banking instruments are allowable for association libraries for funds that are being held for future capital improvements and contingencies?
So association libraries do not fall under general municipal law when it comes to investment vehicles. Therefore, your investments are overseen by an investment policy that should be adopted by the board. So I don't want to say the sky's the limit, because you want to be very careful, particularly if it's money that's coming from public sources. You want to be pretty conservative about where you're investing that, but the board needs probably a financial advisor to help them figure out where's that sweet spot of low risk but as high a yield as possible.
Excellent. Thanks, Rebecca. And then I have one more pre-submitted question that I want to touch on, and then I'm going to dive into the questions that our audience is asking tonight. So the third question is, I understand a recent revision to the open meetings law requires libraries to post any document to be discussed on their website 24 hours in advance of a board meeting. At our board meetings, we routinely review bills, vouchered, cancels, checks, and bank statements. My concern is that posting this material on our website, we are making our financial information very vulnerable to embezzlement. Is this material exempt from posting the online requirement as long as it's made available to the library, to the community 24 hours before a meeting? So could you go into that a little bit?
Let me start with that, Rebecca, and then you'll pick up. First of all, if you're going to review that detail at your board meetings, yes, it would be. But we wonder why you are reviewing such detail in the middle of a board meeting, whereas we recommend in the handbook, frankly, that your finance officer or treasurer or members of the board should review the bills and the backup documents ahead of the board meeting, ask any questions, and at the board meeting, the board, in effect, only reviews and approves the vouchers and warrants and they review and approve. They actually don't have to review rather approve the financial statements. They are what they are. And the treasurer's report. So going into that level of detail is something that is not best practice at a board meeting. We recommend it be done ahead of time because you're right. We would be concerned for sure to have canceled checks sent out to the community ahead of time. I think you're getting too much in the weeds at a board meeting and need to delegate that to a trustee or your treasurer or your finance officer and have them come in a little before the board meeting and go over that kind of detail. And then it's up to that person, that board member, to make the motion to accept the warrant, or with exceptions, if there's a bill that they had problems with. Now, notwithstanding, the bill should be available at the board meeting for any trustee who wants to take a look at them. But you shouldn't be handing checks and vouchers around the table. That's a little bit too much. Rebecca, you have a comment on that?
No, I think you did a great job covering that one, Jerry. That was going to be my comment as well. Of course, they should be available if a question does arise, but again, that's the job of either your treasurer, your warrant officer for that month to review those, ask those questions ahead of time. If they found something out of whack, bring that to the board's attention, perhaps with the documentation, but it wouldn't be something normally on your agenda, which would trigger the need for it to be posted 24 hours in advance to your website.
Right.
Perfect. All right, now we're going to get into the questions of the people watching tonight. So be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A section and we'll try to get to those. But the first one we have up, this actually dates back to our board meeting session. So you'll have to think back a little bit, Rebecca and Jerry. Can an executive board, 4 members, conduct business without a quorum of the board in general? And if so, can they make financial decisions?
Okay. I need a clarification. An executive committee is 5 members by state law, not 4. So they're saying a quorum of the executive committee?
Can an executive board, 4 members, conduct business without quorum of the board? So it sounds like they're moving forward with 4 members without quorum.
Now, I recall that Ed Law 226 defines an executive committee as 5 members. I could be wrong, but I think we went over this only a month or 2 ago. Rebecca, do you recall that quote? I can actually pull it out, but I don't want to waste everybody's time. So that's a good question, and maybe we'll be happy to get back to the person about that if you want to let them know.
I'll earmark it, and then we can always come back to that one and answer it in a future session as well.
Okay, well, I'll just say that let's just say hypothetically, you've got the appropriately sized executive committee, right? And in your bylaws, you should have language that authorizes some level of activity by the executive committee in between board meetings, but it should be very specifically defined in terms of, I think we talked about this at length actually during that session about giving a specific authority. You can't just give blanket authority of the board over to your executive committee. You give them specific authority to deal with an issue you all recognize is going to arise between meetings. So we use the example of the construction project or a lawsuit or litigation where you would imbue the power to the executive committee to act on behalf of the board with that understanding. So for financial reasons in general, I would say no.
Yeah, with one exception, there are some libraries in our state that have extremely large boards. And the work is actually done by their executive committee, but often the executive committee is far more than 5 members.
So Jerry, you were right on. It's Education Law 226.2. The executive committee, you have to elect an executive committee of not less than 5.
Boy, I just admire your multitasking.
Look at your memory, Jerry.
Whoa.
Jeez, nice. Well done. All right. The next one we have up, it looks like it's about interest accruing investments, but the question comes from Roy. When large sums of money, $100,000 plus, are left to the library, where's the best transparent place to deposit it where it can draw interest while still being available for immediate use?
Well, I think it begs the question of what type of library are you? Because if you're a public library and you've taken ownership of that donation, your options are limited to what you see in general municipal law. As an association library, you could explore working with a community foundation or a higher yield account, maybe a money market account where you'd be earning a bit more, but you still have access to it on a regular basis.
And I think this calls to the point where boards, no matter what size library, need to have a team that they can rely on, or a team of experts like their insurance person, an accounting firm that they rely on, attorneys and whatnot. Maybe not, you don't have to keep them on retainer, but at least some people in your community that you trust and that you can get advice from in that regard, because we're not in a position where we can advise you to where to invest your money, but they may well be. So.
This next question I like a lot because it's something that I learned from Jerry and Rebecca over the years, and it's researching the various audits that come in. Stephen asks, are library audits posted on any centralized state website? And I like this because it sounds like Stephen's going to go do some research.
Stephen,
Well,
you hit on one of my favorite hobbies, actually. I'll totally admit to this. I love it because the Office of the State Comptroller does post the audits publicly on their site.
Yeah.
They've shortened the archive length of them, so you can't go back and read some of my favorite audits, but I've got copies of them if you want them. But yeah, you can go back, and I actually track them as they come out to see what are the common themes that libraries are basically getting nailed on. But you can learn so much from reading the audits of other libraries.
Yeah, indeed. When I a few years ago, there was a lot of confusion about the role of a treasurer in libraries. I was able to literally go through all of the audits and see the evolving view of the state controller about library treasurers. But I'm assuming he was only talking about state audits. But if you're going to have, if you're a public library and you have an audit, you should make that available to your community. I believe actually quite often there should be literally a legal notice that tells the community it's available.
Nice. And I just dropped a link in chat for the OSC site, the one that I bookmarked to be able to go through and take a look at some of the OSC audits.
Oh, well, Ron, jinx, I did the same thing.
Another
look
hobby.
at us. Nicely done. All right. Yeah, I learned that one from Rebecca and Jerry a while ago, that you got to peruse that stuff and you'll learn a lot of information about what's going on out there. Cool. All right. The next one from Kenneth. The trustee handbook says that often end of year surplus from the operating funds is transferred into capital fund or for future use. What else can you do with surplus besides put it in a capital fund?
Oh, that you can do whatever you want, to be honest with you. And I'm not suggesting you take trips to Hawaii, but the libraries are actually authorized to create all kinds of funds. And if you follow, even those of you who are strict believers in going by the book, GASB, Government Accounting Standards Board, has a guideline under their section 54 that you set up funds for a variety of reasons. Now, if you're following GASB guidelines, you're actually putting money away for future healthcare costs for your retirees, if you offer that to them, or sick and vacation time. There are any number of reasons you can put money away, as long as you designate it for a particular purpose. It doesn't have to be capital. It can be for sick and vacation. It can be for a retirement system, because the retirement system has been known to send us surprises every once in a while about, oh, we're increasing. Maybe not in the last few years, but during my time, they gave us a surprise of 1,000% increase one year. And so you have a great deal of freedom, but there are good guidelines to do that under GASB 54. Now, granted, you are not required by the state of New York to follow every Government Accounting Standards Board standard, because they don't, but you should, because you're dealing with somebody else's money. And but please set up all the funds you want, and we recommend that you set up that you designate most of your surplus funds to specific purposes, and then have documents to back it up. And if you get a full audit, meaning not just a review, but your accountant can help you designate money to put aside for future expenditures, like vacation and sick time, like health insurance and retirement, and things of that nature. Not that you have to do it all at once, but and they will account for that within your audit. and it will certainly prepare you for the decades ahead.
I'm glad the issue of reserve funds came up early in the evening tonight, because this is something that I frequently come across libraries. I don't want to say mismanaging, I just think they're uninformed about how to manage those funds. So number one, if you've got a surplus, you need to analyze that. How did that happen? Is it a relatively small amount explained by the just changes in the year, which we all know happen, or projects just didn't come out the way we expected to, or maybe there was a pandemic, I don't know. If it's just, easily explained, no biggie, let's transfer that over to the capital fund, which, that's what most libraries are doing at this point, because you've got pretty big capital goals usually that you're working towards anyway. But if you're budgeting for surplus so it can go in your capital fund, that can easily backfire on you. You just need one, savvy taxpayer to take a look at what you're doing there and really question what's going on. So you need to have very solid reserve policies. All of your reserve funds should be guided by board-approved policies. So it's very clear why it was created, how money goes into it, and how money comes out of it, and it needs to be justifiable. So the amounts that you're saving in those reserve funds should be clearly tied to something. So there's not just a capital fund that you're throwing money into, there's a capital fund policy that explains the board's long-term and short-term facility plans, that you're saving for the end of the useful life of your roof, of the HVAC system, like Jerry said earlier, or you're out of space and you're starting to build up the funds that you need to hire an architect to do master planning, or even to do the whole expansion or renovation project. So you don't want to have some massive savings account that is for a rainy day, or if something goes wrong. We'd all love to have that big safety net, but you are accountable to the taxpayer. So we have to explain and justify, because if you don't, if someone's reading your financial reports and sees you sitting on this huge amount of money while you're also asking for more in tax dollars, they could easily say, why aren't you just using that reserve you don't seem to have a purpose for? So be careful, have good documentation. And I think that's really the big lesson about reserve funds, is that policy, that board-approved policy for them.
Rebecca, you're right. I think I'll spend just another minute or two on this. If you're a public library, the state controller has opined many times that you are allowed to maintain as large a fund balance as you want. Yet when they audit, they've criticized libraries for having a huge fund balance, but not knowing what they're going to do with it. And we all relentlessly recommend that if you're going to have a capital fund, you go and spend some money on an engineering report to tell you when that HVAC system is going to go bad, when is that roof going to go bad, how much is it going to cost? Because we have any number of times where the state auditors have come in and said, you've got millions of dollars in the bank, what are you going to do with it? And if you can pull that report out and give it to them, they say, great, thank you very much, issue is done. By the same token, you shouldn't be making too much money every year, like Rebecca said. And I'm just gonna, I know I'm a few years out of it, but we had a rule of thumb. It was not bad to end the year with 3% left of the budget, because something could have happened. And 3% is not, that's just a rule of thumb. Please don't take it to the bank. Well, yeah, take it to the bank, because some years you didn't have the 3%. Some years something happened, stuff happens. By the same token, I think it's important that you understand that most of you need a cash flow. And I'm used to dealing with school district public libraries most of my career, and I always recommended they have 3-month cash flow, because you can't trust the schools to give you your money on time. I know they should, but it depends on your deal. And so if you can, you don't necessarily have to put every penny away into a reserve fund. You can have undesignated funds that's allowed within the controller's, process and review. Don't overdo it. So if you're going to have more than a month or two, just have a reason for it. And ultimately be aware that you might need some money to tide you over. And I'm sure there's a few other things, that this is a great topic. So I'm sure some other questions will come up later.
The next question we have coming in from James: can trustee, and there may be some specifics to this one, but the general question is, can trustees also be fundraisers for the library's foundation?
So I'm sorry, Drew, I'm going to take this one because when I started at the Mid-Hudson Library System, I worked on a grant project that was helping libraries with fundraising. And early in my career on this topic, I called the Division of Library Development, and two wonderful consultants that are now long retired. I called my consultant and said, hey, are public library trustees allowed to fundraise? And she yells across the aisle to her colleague, and oh, Rebecca at Mid-Hudson's asking about fundraising. And they start bickering because one of them believed, yes, you can. The other one believed, no, you can't. And they just went at it. And I feel like for 20 years, I've been searching for the right answer on this topic. So let me start by saying that for public library trustees, you have to watch out that none of your operating or public funds are being used for fundraising purposes. That's clearly not allowable. However, how you spend your time outside of the governing board, you want to help fundraise for the foundation, go for it, but make it really clear what's going on in that respect. Association libraries, 100%, and in many cases, you have to be involved in fundraising, particularly for underfunded or chronically underfunded association libraries. There's no problem there. The issue that you want to keep a real close eye on is that you're not using staff time paid with public dollars for fundraising purposes.
Yep.
That was a great answer to a 20-year-old debate, Rebecca. Very nicely said.
I'm calling it.
There we go. It's done. It's been answered. The next one, we touched on this in the book club after party. So if you haven't watched that yet, it's on Mid-Hudson's website. But this one comes in from Francis, and he's just looking for any updates on the development of the rules for the requiring trustee training, the law that was recently signed, or the bill that was recently signed into law.
Yeah, no guidelines have been issued yet. We've been asking the Division of Library Development and offering to help with that from the Public Library System Directors Organization. So your system director is going to have the best information available when something changes, but for now, there's no status update on that.
Robin asks, would the comptroller audit a municipal library on its own or only as part of a municipal audit?
They would audit you on your own.
Yeah, not usually, but often.
This next question touches back on the reserve funds that we have, and you may not have a specific answer for this, and I feel like you covered it with your answer earlier, but just in case, Stuart wants to know what percentage of the operating budget is it appropriate for a public library to have in reserve?
Jerry, maybe I'll start with this one, but I think we have to talk about what reserve, right? You should have multiple reserve funds. Yeah. We all talk about a capital reserve fund. We all understand it takes big bucks to maintain a building. That's one type of reserve. There's the cash flow reserve that Jerry mentioned, which can be different depending on your situation. You might have a fiscal year that starts in January, but the tax dollars don't come in until April or May, and you need to be able to, pay your bills between January and May. So you might have that type of reserve policy. You might have a contingency reserve, and that's usually the one that's based on a percentage of your overall annual budget. And that one, I think that's where you want to be careful, that you're thinking through very carefully what percentage of your budget might be in a reserve like that. 10% is very common, but if you could justify more, I'm sure you could write a board policy that would explain that.
Yeah, it's that there's really no one answer to that question at all. I'm aware of libraries that have, when they fulfilled obligations under all Gatsby standards, they're putting money away for health insurance for retirement for their retirees, and they're putting money away for vacation and sick time. And the controllers come in and said, wait a minute, this is a lot of money. And the library maintains that it's according to Gatsby. And just as Rebecca said, make sure you can clearly define the purpose of the money. And it should not be excessive, because then it becomes a political issue. And by the way, I guess something we should have brought up earlier, once you set up a reserve funds, at any board meeting with a vote of the board, of course, a full vote, of the board, in other words, a majority of the entire board, you can transfer that money either into another reserve fund or into your operating fund. It's not a big deal. So if you all of a sudden decide that you're building a library and you want to use more reserve funds and you have money set aside for the next time the retirement system hits you with a big bill, move it into capital reserve if you want. So it's perfectly okay to do that.
I saw someone in the chat very helpfully noted that school districts have a cap on their reserve amounts, and there's not a
Right.
similar cap for library. So technically there is no cap, but if you were looking for a guidepost, that might be one to use.
They're a little low though compared to us, and there's a reason why school districts are so low. They can get school building aid. We can't. And so the controller literally since the 40s has allowed us to have no cap on our reserve funds, but they will question it during the audit if it becomes excessive. And frankly, it becomes a political liability unless you've got a plan for it.
This next question comes in, and it's about claims auditor. And I think it's referring to a conversation that we had previously on claims auditing and the designation of authority. But it asks, you mentioned before that it's not a good idea for a library to hire an outside person as a claims auditor. Can you please elaborate on why this is not a good idea?
Let me jump into that. Although Rebecca's the one that gave me the quote. The auditor, the New York State Controller, has specifically said that the law does not allow a library board of trustees to abdicate its responsibility for the claims auditing process, period. The school boards either failed in that or they've got such a lot of money to deal with, they now have to have a claims auditor. You cannot abdicate that. And there are libraries that hired them anyway, but if you did, that's just belt and suspenders. Your board still has to be able to go over the boards, the bills and authorize their expenditure. They cannot abdicate that. It's very, very clear. And if you look at some of the, I don't recall which, oh yeah, the booklet on claims auditing that the auditor, that the state controllers put out says that, I think in one of the appendices is very clear about libraries. And thank you, Rebecca, for finding that one out.
I'm putting it in the chat box just to
There you go.
celebrate the find.
Multitasking again. Wow, that's fast.
I'm pretty sure Rebecca just has all of these open on her computer at all times and she knows exactly where they are.
Another generation.
Okay. Next question comes from Reed. How can the board make sure that the executive director is making the best purchasing decisions for the library without the board acting as a micromanager? So a little bit about the roles and responsibilities a little bit. In this specific case, especially about energy usage, purchasing solar energy, saving devices, and controlling actual usage of kilowatts. So it looks like there's a specific situation for energy usage, but looking at how can they not be a micromanager, but making sure that the director is making the best purchasing decisions possible.
Well, Jerry, I'll start this, but then I want you to tell your marker story about questioning the colored markers. But this goes back to board priorities and board policy. So in the specific example about energy usage, has the board prioritized renewable energy in their capital planning or their goals for the year? And so are they then making sure the director is aware that they want the director to dig deeper in the options that they have on that particular area? So I'm not going to go line by line in a typical budget to say how you don't micromanage, but I'd say you want to be very clear about your top goals and priorities so your director has a fighting chance to maybe explore or research other options in a particular area. But absolutely, in the example I remember from Jerry when I met him almost 20 years ago, was talking about a board that was like questioning the color markers that the director bought for like children's programs. Like that's micromanaging.
Yeah, I would, the nature of the question makes me assume that if they're buying solar power, I'm familiar with a library whose library director quite candidly said, no, the payback on this it's not a 3-year payback. It's maybe a 7-year payback, but that's not why we bought it. The board wanted to set an example for their community of leadership when it came to sustainability. And this is some years ago. I'm sure solar power is cheaper now, but does the purchase fit in with your ultimate goals? And it might not be cheaper. But when you're building a library, frankly, you could build a cheap library building, or you could build one that everybody loves. It's a question of value and a question of inspiration, and maybe you're going to inspire the community. There's no price on inspiration and being a model for change. So I think as a board, you need to take that into consideration.
I know we're going to do a whole session just on facilities and we'll talk about sustainability, but sustainability is not just about going green. It's also about your local economy and supporting that. So for example, at Mid-Hudson, we allow a premium if we're able to support a local business, because that's part of our board's values. That we want to see the local economy thrive, or we want to have as sustainable building as possible when it comes to how we operate it. So again, being clear in your priorities in your facility plan, in your procurement policies, that's where some of those things that you can't oversee on a day-to-day basis get addressed.
Well said.
Jerry, this next one might be for you, just because I know you like to quote specific laws, but Thomas is looking for which specific law applies to library trustees' sole authority over the expenditures or transfer of funds on an approved budget.
259 subdivision 1.
There it goes.
And he needs to look at the opinions. There's a lot of opinions regarding that. And it's not just, of course, the school district library knows it, the special district library knows it, but it also applies to municipal libraries. We mentioned before about having a separate municipal fund. So if you're a village or a town or a county library, once that money is set aside in the library fund, it is only to be expended under the authority of the Board of Trustees of the library. The control is very clear about that. And I'm insistent on it because there are some libraries that are bullied by their municipalities, and that's just not the way it's supposed to be. The Board of Trustees has the ultimate authority to determine how that money is spent, unquote.
Rebecca, earlier you had mentioned the conflict of interest form, and John has a question about that. So do all trustees need to re-sign conflict of interest forms each and every year, or just new members of the board?
The conflict of interest form should be done annually by all trustees.
The next one comes from Diane, and she asks, who should be conducting the budget review, the treasurer / president, or entire board, prior to presenting it to the town board for approval?
Well, I think go ahead, Rebecca. It's all yours because you reviewed this already.
Yeah, so when your budget process, your director has developed it. If you're a larger board, you probably have a finance committee that's then spent some time with it and makes a recommendation to the full board to approve it, or in your case, to approve it for presentation. So ultimately, you want that full board, your full library board, to buy in and I shouldn't say buy in, but to approve that entire document before it's presented to the town board. You don't want any surprises for any of the library trustees before that goes before the town.
Is there a state set bid threshold, or is that set by the individual library?
If you're public, it's $20,000 for materials, and it's $35,000 for materials and services. And if you look at some of the links that Rebecca has put up and will be put up in our toolkit and are in the handbook, it gives you procurement guidelines. If you're public, if you're an association library, you should set your own up. But in addition to those thresholds, the controller gives you guidelines regarding purchasing under those guidelines. For example, if something costs more than $5,000, you make phone calls. If it's more than $10,000, you get written bids, things of that nature. And it's imperative that every library has a procurement policy. If you're public, that's something you will be audited about.
Okay, I think Maureen's question here, I feel like we answered most of this earlier on when we were talking about reserve funds, but I'll read it out just in case we missed something. For a municipal library, what reserves funds can you have? We talked about that. If the town owns the building, but the library is responsible for painting, HVAC systems, office furniture, etc., that are not capital reserves, is there another reserve that we can set up a plan for these maintenance and repair expenses?
Okay, I need a little clarification. Is this a municipal library? Is it an association library living in a, I think we need to know who does what to where. I don't know what their arrangement is. But by all means, if the municipality is not taking care of the building, the library board had better put some money aside. I guess that's all I can say for that. Rebecca, maybe you have a better insight into this
Well, I would
question.
say, don't forget, you should have a line in your annual budget for facility issues that come
Yeah.
up, like painting and furniture. These are routine costs that come up, and that should just be a regular line in your budget. But I would say you could also have a capital fund if you were saving up for, you wanted to have lockers outside the library so that folks could access their books outside of library hours. That's a big ticket item you might want to save up for, and you could have a capital fund to save up for bigger things like that. But don't forget about your building and operations line in your annual budget, which should be funded. So in a way, the municipality is going to pay for it one way or the other, but you shouldn't assume you have to find alternative funds for that.
Yeah, and by the way, the controller actually gives you a budget code that you can assign money to for reserves for that nature, not just for this year's expenditures, but for a capital reserve fund. You can build it up every year. It's perfectly legal.
Okay, Robin would like to know, is there a difference between a treasurer and a finance officer?
Well, we have a link to that. We have an appendix in the trustee handbook, and yeah, I'll be real quick rather than giving you the 5-page memo that I wrote on that. If you're a public library, municipal, special, or school district, a trustee cannot hold 2 offices, and the treasurer is another officer of the corporation, and you must have a separate treasurer that is not a trustee. Now, if you're a school district library, by default, the school district treasurer can be your treasurer as well. And of course, they have to have a separate library fund. We certainly don't recommend that, but it's very typical, cheap and easy way to do it. You should pay them separate though, and get them to come in and do your bank reconciliation. If you're an association library, by all means, one of your trustees can be the treasurer, and the treasurer should have the responsibility to oversee the accounting issues, the fiduciary responsibility, the process of segregation of duties, and frankly, to reconcile bank statements. So it depends on what kind of library you are. But if you're a public library, no, you're a trustee is perfectly okay to be a finance officer. They should be chair of the budget committee. They can be the one that goes over the bills every month and makes and recommends the warrant be approved, but they're not the treasurer who comes in and signs the checks after the board approves them.
I just want to give a special shout out to special district libraries. You have to be careful. You have to just double check. Is there any language specific to the role of the treasurer in your special district legislation?
Yeah.
I know special district libraries are rare birds in many parts of the state. I think in Mid-Hudson have the most of any system. So it's something we're pretty familiar with. But special district libraries, always check your legislation for something like that. But I've also put in the chat box the link to what made Jerry and I smile, because this was a tough thing to kind of suss out, because we've seen conflicting opinions from the Office of the State Comptroller. So just a reminder that in the appendices of the trustee handbook is a whole explanation about the role of the public library treasurer.
And once again, apparently what we did was okay with the controller. So
yeah, we did vet it with them, which was a fun experience.
Yeah.
This next one's from a municipal library. Does the town include the library in the AUD to the state comptroller's office, or does the library submit a separate AUD, the annual update document?
I think that just depends. Who does it for you? Do you, and Rebecca has more experience with this because most of the municipal libraries I'm familiar with, the money is completely controlled by the municipality. And so that they submit those documents, but Rebecca tells me that she's got some that actually get their money. So I'm going to defer to you right now.
Yeah, I have situations that I hate to say this, but it could go either way. So I have 8 municipal libraries, 6 of which act quite separately from the municipality. Their money's just turned over to them and they act completely independent of the municipality, including filing their own AUD. But for the 2 that are really closely enmeshed, where they have to hand over vouchers to get bills paid, yeah, they're not filing their own AUD with the comptroller's office.
And they're probably audited as part of the municipality when the state does its audit as well, I'm sure. So
we are crushing these questions. We're
Good
up
thing you got
to,
that house, Ron.
We're trying to be
I know,
short. We're
no,
trying to,
we don't worry.
no
We still have
stories.
plenty. We've answered 17 out of, and we have 24 still in the queue, and we didn't answer all the ones that were asked ahead of time. So kudos to everybody for asking so many questions. This one comes from Evelyn. All board members, so there's 7 of them, are sent the list of bills monthly. Finance committee reviews the listing of expenditures monthly and then makes a recommendation to the full board regarding payment of said bills. Is this equivalent to a claims auditing procedure? And do we really need to see the actual receipts?
Then the actual receipts should be available at the board meeting should anyone want to look at them. But that sounds like a pretty thorough process to me, Rebecca. What about, yeah, I mean, everybody's doing it. I mean, that's the ideal. When the controller first came out, he wanted every single board meeting member to look at every single bill, and they got blowback from so many libraries saying, wait a minute, you got to be crazy. Let's just get a process whereby 1 or 2 board members look at it. And I know one board has a different board member, they rotate it, so everybody is familiar with it. But that sounds like a great process.
Good job, Evelyn, for having a great process. Let's see. The next one we're looking at, and I think this is talking about the new-ish law. So where can I find the actual description about making board meeting agenda items public? I got it about the warrants, but what do you but want to know more about other items and how specific public explanation must be?
So I'll say your source of origin on this one is the Committee on Open Government from New York State. They're the oversight agency for open meetings law and the Freedom of Information law. You might not see the level of information that you're hoping for in the law itself. You'll want to look at their opinions on open meetings law. And I will say the rate at which they are putting opinions out has not kept up with the changes to the law this year. So there may be some interpretation necessary. You might want to chat with your system who may have already answered that question for another library. And I'll say the staff at the Committee on Open Government, they are extremely responsive. You can count on a response from them if you reach out to them with a question.
I might also add, Rebecca, since I only did this yesterday, they have a banner at the top of the Committee on Open Government about recent changes to open meetings law, just so it's just what the changes were. And it does deal exactly with that question, but not to the specificity that we've been getting. Do the best you can. That's meet the the idea of the law, the spirit of it. That's all.
We talk about when we talk to our trustees for trustee essentials workshops here at Mid-Hudson, we always say good faith effort. You're not a superhuman, you can't know every little detail, but let's think about what a reasonable person would do under similar circumstances and do our best if we can't find the answer or we're not sure what to do. Always check with your system. They often have had to answer that question before. It's pretty rare you're the first person to have some question like that. So your system is always a great clearinghouse to first start there to get your answers.
Okie dokie. Joan is up next. Our town has placed 5,000 plus in the library's budget under library, or sorry, our town has placed $5,000 plus in the town's budget under quote library. Should this money be given to the library to be used as they see fit, or must the monies be piecemealed out after submitting a paid voucher from the trustees?
They have the right. The board has the right to determine how that money is spent, but the town has the right to actually write the checks. I think that's dumbing it down, making it as simple as possible. It would be nice if they just sent you the money, but that's in Rebecca's world, not in the world that I've had experience with. The town does not have the right to determine how to spend that money, but they have the right to put that money aside for library purposes. It's yours to spend as you see fit, and it's under your authority. It's very clear from the controller's opinions that you need to send the bills over and let them pay them.
I would say just the one little caveat I would say is it sounded like it was kind of voluntarily put there by the municipality. If you ever have an instance in which you have already had a municipal ballot vote or a 414 vote as a municipal library, which means the voters have dictated how much funds the libraries will receive out of town tax dollars, the town actually must turn them over to you upon written request of the treasurer. So that would be my only little, I just don't know the whole situation that you're describing there. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, and Rebecca, this reminds me of situations that I actually was aware of in Mid-Hudson, where some of the counties set aside money for the libraries, and I don't know if they put strings on it. If they're not municipal libraries, they just the Ulster County gives every library $5,000. I'm not sure they give it to them or how they want to handle it. But if this is not a municipal library, this is just a local library in the town who's given them money, call them up and say, how do we get it?
Okay, Barbara's up next. If the town board doesn't want to increase taxes, how can the library board suggest to the town board that the library's budget, that the library's budget is not balanced, expecting fuel cost increases, cost of living increases for staff, et cetera, by using the library's reserve fund? So it sounds like the town doesn't want to increase it, and they want them to use their reserve fund to cover those expenses.
Yeah, without a public vote, you're really at the mercy of the town in that situation, which is why I feel like I get to say it at every session we do. That's why I've devoted so much of my time to helping libraries get a public vote on their budget, even as municipal public libraries, because I think you want the opportunity to address reality and not compromise reserves that are there for specific reasons.
And, oh, go ahead, Jerry.
No, it's you're up.
No, that's all right. I was going to say another question that had come in that was related to this. One library had said that they are in a great relationship with their municipality right now, and they don't have any issues. However, they are concerned that eventually they may have turnover in the town supervisor or the town board, and it may not be so easy. So when is a good time to pursue that public vote, even when you're on good terms right now and you don't necessarily want to offend the current administration? But at the same time, make sure that you're securing the library funding.
In a way, it's almost like the same answer we gave last session on personnel of when to do the director evaluation. Like when things are going great, it's so much easier to do the evaluation, right? Like when you wait until things are like just going downhill fast, your ability to gather the support you need and to talk to somebody reasonably who isn't already anti-library or suspicious about the library, it's just a really heavy lift. If you can have some reasonable conversations with a leader at the municipality level who really believes in the library, has obviously demonstrated support by budgeting appropriately for the library. If you explain to them, like another thing they could do to secure their legacy of supporting the library would be to help lift this out of the town budget into a municipal ballot vote. That would be a true legacy of that town supervisor or mayor. So I think it's way easier to have the conversation with someone whose ears are open to you than someone who's suspicious of you. So it's, I can't speak in every situation. The politics are so different from town to town, village to village, city to city. So certainly depends on a variety of issues, but I would say explore it while things are going well. It'd be way easier than when things get rough. Of course, you can always villainize the guy that, the person who's giving you a hard time and use that to your advantage. That's a whole campaign strategy thing we can talk about at the bar.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Rebecca, because way in the distant past, when we first came out with the public library district model, myself and a colleague, Jim Farrell, who you of course remember, met with town and county business officials. And they were delighted that there would be a way to get rid of the library. But they had no political axe to grind. They didn't have, there was not about what we're in charge of. They thought it would be a great idea, and they were very supportive of us moving ahead and providing libraries with a way to become independent, because they didn't feel it was a comfortable fit for them. And if you've got a friend there, that's good to talk to. Maybe you can get something started. And again, move ahead toward a more independent and stable legal and financial future.
I'll just run, if I could just add one more thing, I'll say that something we weren't able to put into the new toolkit that's going to be released by the Division of Library Development on sustainable funding options is a little commentary I'd like to share with you here this evening, which is that once they understand it, most municipal leaders are like, oh, thank you. I'd love to get that off my books and make that not my problem. So don't assume a negative reaction, but do plan to help them understand something that's pretty rare in the scheme of things. But honestly, in almost 100% of the cases of the votes I've done over 30 of them from inception. That has been the reaction once they fully wrap their minds around it.
Right.
Okay, the next one, I'm going to try to sum up a few. There's been a few questions that have come in about the executive committee, so I'm going to try to all lump them into one question because they're pretty similar. So it looks like the executive committee for libraries consists of president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. And they're wondering how can there be 5 members? But I think it's you may have 4 officers, but there needs to be 5 members of that executive committee. And also to go along with that, there was just a couple questions about asking if you could explain is there any difference between an executive committee for an association library versus an executive committee for a public library.
I'll answer the first one, Jerry, because it's easy. But your bylaws should define that 5th position. It's often the immediate past president, or in the absence of such, a member at large.
Okay. And it would seem to me executive committees are only meant when you have a very large number of board members, and you could have 25. But if you've got 5 or 7 or 9, I don't see a purpose for an executive committee. You know, I really don't, unless there's some extreme emergency and a number of people are going to be away for a long time. And if they are, they should just resign and get new board members. But there are libraries that have many, many board members, New York Public and Brooklyn and Queens and whatnot. And some libraries I'm aware of have, 24, 23, 22 board members. And then they don't meet, everybody doesn't meet every month. They all meet quarterly, So I'd be surprised if it's something that many libraries took advantage of to get their business done. Because if you're a trustee, show up.
This one goes back to a conversation we were having earlier about surplus and then public funds. So if there is a surplus of library money, is there a reason to raise the budget, in quotes, asking for public money? When the public votes for a yearly library budget, what amount sends up a red flag? So is it necessary to raise the budget? And is there an amount that would send up a red flag to the community?
Could I mean, are they talking about an amount of surplus or the amount of
increase? I think it's the amount of surplus that would throw up a red flag, because that's the primary thing that they're talking about in this one, I think, Jerry.
I'm just going to go off on a tangent and say that's the job of the Board of Trustees. That's what you're elected for, to know. I lecture boards when they do building projects. I said, I believe in magic numbers. You're there to know what the magic number is, what's too much. But to have a surplus, remember, it's not bad to have a surplus if you're going to use it for something, planning for the future. But if you're running 10 and 15% surpluses a year, there's something wrong. You've been entrusted to spend that money for library service, not to hoard that money. And I know there are some trustees that are very proud about, let's save. It's not about doing it as cheaply as you can. It's about doing as well as you can. So if there happens to be a year like the COVID year, you had money left over, okay, fine. Find a good purpose for it. Or many libraries during COVID did not ask for a community increase. They realized, we don't know what's going on. We don't need new money. Let's just go with it. Right now, you got inflation of 5 to 7%. If you don't take an increase, you're going backwards. And so be careful about that. And again, I think this is something that's what a board is for, to say what is too much and what is not enough. But don't be afraid of having money left over, as long as you say, okay, let's use this for something special. And Rebecca brought the point up. Everything's changed so much. There's got to be things that you can spend that money to enhance the safety and comfort of your building. Because people are coming back to the library, but they want it to be a safe place.
This next question comes from Barbara, and I wonder what type of library she's talking about, because she asks, what's the difference in accountability of reserve funds created from fundraisers other than reserve surplus of unspent operating funds? So it sounds like she has these two kind of divisions between fundraising and then operating funds of surplus.
Well, Ron, you're spot on to ask what type of library is this? It's an association library. Nobody cares, right?
Well, I would one caution there. If you fundraised for a purpose, you better stick with that purpose. Don't commingle. I mean, you can commingle them in investment, but keep a separate fund. If you're fundraising for building, then you better keep a handle on that. Then, and if you have other surplus funds from, your operating funds, designate where they go. You could add them to the building fund if you wanted, but please, if you're doing fundraising and people are doing it for a purpose, you fulfill that obligation and keep that trust.
There's a famous story usually in the higher education world. I like to read the Chronicle of Philanthropy because I'm a nerd. But there's at least once a year some university that raised money to build some specific building. Then they're like, actually, we're going to go build something else. And the donors have the right to ask for that money back. So your ability to track money that you've fundraised for a specific purpose to demonstrate it was actually spent for that purpose is incredibly important from a public relations and authenticity side.
Yeah. If you betray your trust once, you're not going to get it back in your lifetime.
So this one is it starts as a follow-up, and I think they were talking about the fundraising piece earlier when we were talking about that. But Darcy says we have an agreement with our friends to support them with advertising / staff time for their work. Is this out of compliance? I'm assuming that this is working with friends fundraisers, but Darcy, you can go ahead and add in if it means something different.
I'll give this one to you. I mean, I know every library helps their friends out off the record, but.
Well, let's be clear that friends do more than just fundraising. They also do friend raising, which is to increase goodwill in the community towards your library. So you're normally seeing your friends groups do, one or more of three things, which is, finding more friends for the library, that people think well of the library. They're volunteers at events and sometimes working in the library, and they're also often fundraisers. So I think let's just be clear of what is the support being given. If you're underwriting staff time to help with publicity for the friends, which results in more friends joining, so you have more volunteers and ultimately more dollars coming in, most of those, that publicity that you're doing is not going to be about fundraising solely. So there's a fine line there, but I think that's what your director is there to judge and to help your friends group understand the limits of what's possible with the staff support time.
And it looks like we have a whole slew of fundraising questions, so let's go ahead and get into those. So this is from Mary regarding fundraising. How do you differentiate applying for grants like those offered by New York State and the various library systems from fundraising in your response to using taxpayer dollars for fundraising?
20 years in counting, Rebecca.
That's right. So let's be clear, like if there are items that the board has said are important to achieve the goals, the strategic goals of the library. So for example, that you need to renovate the children's room in order to meet the goals you've set for yourself in the area of early literacy in the strategic plan, and seeking grants is one of the ways you plan to diversify and fund that project. It's not unreasonable to have development staff that are involved in grant writing. I think what we're thinking about is staff that have been paid to work the front desk of the library, and then their attention and energy is being diverted to support the Friends Gala over here. And meanwhile, public service is suffering because we haven't fully invested in the staff that are supposed to be there to provide actual library services. So this is definitely a management issue, and it's something I've certainly seen directors and boards and friends groups and foundations clash over when people feel they're not getting what they think they should get out of it. But let's all remember, the whole reason we're here is to provide quality library service to the public. And if that gets compromised by diverting their time over for fundraising energy over here, there's a disconnect there. So creating lanes for fundraising is really important. So having a separate lane, having a separately incorporated friends group or foundation for libraries that are doing a lot of fundraising, that's going to be really important. And maybe budgeting for them to have, they're paying for clerical support to do the big events that they want to do, but let's not divert time from public service for fundraising purposes. And
I think a question that often comes up, I think, was within this overall one is applying for grants, the board applying for grants, is that fundraising and is that against the law, for a public library? And bottom line is no. I got a legal opinion on this years ago, and the attorney said it's all clear as mud. If you're applying for New York State construction grant, apply for if you're applying to the Kellogg's Foundation for $500,000 to do a building, go do it. There's no library police in that. And just having the board act in its official capacity to apply for grants is not a violation of using public funds for private fundraising. So please go for that stuff. But be careful if you're a public library and when you're doing the little sending out the letters every year asking for money that of your community. That's be careful about that. That's all.
And I just want to add on to this one because I see a lot of boards get obsessed with this idea, and I understand where it's coming from, that you want to diversify the finances and the revenue of the library and demonstrate that you've sought all sources before coming back to the taxpayer, which is very, very responsible. But in the meantime, are you compromising the governance work of the board? Because I'll see boards get so obsessed with doing a gala that brings in like this teeny tiny amount of money, but meanwhile, the policies aren't getting addressed, the building's falling down around them, the director hasn't had a performance appraisal in years. Let's just remember the governance role of the library is to secure adequate funding, and the most expeditious way to do so is to use voter directed funding and directing your energy towards passing that vote, which stabilizes your funding rather than destabilizing your funding by relying on fundraising to make ends meet at the end of the year.
Yeah. And I one last comment, and I know some of you do this, but some boards fall in love with the idea of a foundation. Do your homework. That's a separate, independent group. You don't completely control them. And that should not be your major or a significant factor insofar as funding your library operations. If you're going to use a foundation for specific special events like art or music or buildings, fine, but do your homework. Just don't jump into it because you said, oh, this is a magic wand to give us money. Please. You need, it's not easy. And I know a number of foundations that have failed and it's been ugly, where they've had to call in the Secretary of State to put them out of business and then try to find the money. So please don't jump into that because you think it's a magic bullet.
As a follow-up to that, so a question came in and it's asking, can a trustee, specifically the treasurer, also be the treasurer of the foundation? Does that person have to recuse themselves from spending decisions of the foundation?
I don't know. I think that the fact that they're asking the question makes one think that that's not a good idea. They're separate organizations, so technically I'm sure you can be the treasurer of a library and the treasurer of the local fire district and the treasurer of the school district. There's no reason you can't be the treasurer of but that question begs that there might be conflicts, so I would be careful.
I would agree with that. I think you'd want separation. In every single situation I've been involved with where a library decides to start a foundation, they immediately say, we'll just have the same board. We'll have the library board be the board of the foundation. And 100% of the time, it does not work.
No, it's different.
And I saw it pop up a few times in the corner of my eye in chat. There were a handful of people that were asking about library trustees and their participation as friends too. So should library trustees be friends of the library as well?
Such a good question. And I hope all of you with friends groups have found United for Libraries, which is the division of ALA that provides support for friends groups and foundations. But the advice is that 100% you should be a dues paying member of your friends group, but you should not be an officer of the friends group.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think this may be the last fundraising question, at least in this run that I have. This one asks, so many libraries employ development managers, fundraising professionals. How can public money be used to pay salaries of a fundraiser?
My understanding is in most cases where they do that, they're not using public money. That person's got to make their keep, and they got to make their own keep. And if they're not bringing enough money in to pay for it, then you might have an issue. I do not know in particular where it's, the chapter and verse where that's not legal, but if they're not making enough to pay for themselves, then you got a problem. Rebecca, you have experience with this particular thing? I know some large libraries do it, but usually it's part of their foundation. And and it's handled that way, and that's who pays them, is the foundation.
I've seen it done in multiple ways. A lot of times it's being paid for by the foundation, or they're in a situation like a professional fundraiser, where they're a contractor for the library. So
point.
it's not
Yeah.
necessarily an employee of the library, but the service the library has contracted for that's underwritten by fundraised funds or the Friends Group or a foundation. So I'm not saying that there are not development staff that aren't paid out of public dollars in libraries. You can often justify that looking at what they're actually doing. Are they the ones that are writing that state aid for library construction grant? Because that's perhaps justifiable. So
Okay.
it's just an area that we're urging caution in, and that you really analyze how it's being paid for.
Okay. The DLD annual for the DLD annual report, we're required to submit. It does not give multiple reserve options. If you have a health insurance reserve and a maintenance and repair reserve, does this all get lumped into the capital reserve? So it looks like this one is the for the annual report, not having multiple reserve lines.
You're asking the wrong people the right
Yeah,
question.
I'm not familiar with this one either.
For our other work on the district updating the district toolkit, we got all the raw data from the state annual reports, and good luck, folks.
I think this is a great one to remind people that your library system is a great point of contact. We have somebody here that really focuses on annual reports, and they're able to answer any questions and things like that. It could be different in all systems, but check with them to see if they're able to help you with that situation.
Great point. And by the way, they're also the point person to ask the state library to amend and fix the report so it's more realistic for you.
Yeah, I realized a few seconds too late that Casey Conlon is with us tonight, who actually does the annual reports here at the Mid-Hudson Library System. Casey, I saw you put your hand up. I'm wondering if you have the answer to that question.
Oh, great.
Casey, chime in.
So Anonymous, you are not alone. I also love the annual report, and I wanted to chime in. I appreciate everybody giving me time here. I'm going to look you up on Craigslist missed connections later, Anonymous, but to answer your question 12.36 in the annual report could be used for classifying the funds that you're talking about. It might also just be part of your funds at the end of the year in the reserve that you have. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Casey.
What a team
Thanks,
you've
Casey.
got there.
Man, that's good. That is good.
12.1.5, whatever.
Okay, I feel like this next question, Jerry, this might just be a quiz for you, and they want to see you flex a little bit. What does Education Law 226 cover?
226 is basically the primary responsibilities for trustees of educational organizations in the state of New York, museums, universities, libraries, even schools. So it covers very basic things like number of trustees and their powers and duties. Actually, that's what it is, powers and duties of trustees. It allows you to buy, sell, mortgage property. It allows you to expend funds. It allows you to hire people and pay them. So I suggest it's very simple. It's very short, but it gives you your basic responsibilities and authority. It also tells you how to get rid of a trustee. Those of you who have elected trustees, you have another step. You got to go through the state ed department. But take it, read it. It's very short. It's available online. I think we go over it very briefly in the trustee handbook as well. And the other one you should look at, if you're a public library especially, or any library, is Ed Law 260, my favorite. Ed Law 260, subdivision 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. I finally refer to as the Declaration of Independence for school district public libraries. And the special library districts that have been formed over the last 20 some odd years have all got a clause in their enabling legislation that says, unless otherwise specified in this legislation, you fall under Ed Law 260, which gives you the same ability and authority as school district libraries to have their own votes, to pick their own architects, et cetera, and require school boards, or in your case, in a special district, probably town boards, to bond for them. So yes, it's my quiz. Thank you very much.
Well, with that, we've reached the end of our time for tonight. So Rebecca and Jerry, I just want to thank you so much. And a reminder to everybody that the recording of this will be posted to the Mid-Hudson website where you were able to find the registration links for this and the upcoming Trustee Handbook Book Clubs. That's midhudson.org/trustee book club. And I'm sure Casey and Brian will drop that in the chat box. Just as a reminder, February 22nd is our next Trustee Handbook Book Club coming up, and it's going to be all about facilities. And you'll be able to see the rest of the dates coming up. Please register. It's so great to have you here with all of your questions. I know we didn't get to all of them tonight, so we'll go ahead and grab those and see what we can do about answering them in the future. So Rebecca and Jerry, thank you again so much. I appreciate you being here with us tonight, and we'll see everybody next month.
Thank you, Ron. Great job.
Thank you,
Take
Ryan.
care.
Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Casey, thanks, my friend. Good job.
Thanks, Casey.